an audience at the National Press Club 2 weeks ago. General Scherer is the former head of military intelligence for Germany. Quote, "In the spring of 1982, here in the Soviet embassy, there were very important secret talks that were held. The question was, did the United States and the Soviet Union wish jointly to develop an anti-ballistic missile defense that would have made nuclear war impossible? Then in August 1982, you had this very sharp Soviet rejection of the entire idea. This is General Scherer still talking, I have discussed this thoroughly with the developer, the originator of this idea, who is the scientific, technological, strategic expert Lyndon LaRouche. The Soviet rejection came in August 1982, and at that point, the American President Reagan decided to push this entire thing out into the public eye. So he made his speech of March 1983 after the Soviets had rejected LaRouche. LaRouche called this strategy relativistic beam weapon anti-missile defense, or energy beam weapon anti-missile defense. He also called it the higher peace movement, in contradistinction to the nuclear freeze movement of the early 1980s. President Reagan called it the Strategic Defense Initiative. 1 month ago, at a Princeton University conference, 2 former Soviet government ministers, including, is this now working? Yes. Yeah. Two former Soviet ministers, including a former foreign minister, Besmertnik, acknowledged that it was the Strategic Defense Initiative that caused the collapse of the Soviet Empire. I'll refer back to this conference at Princeton last month a number of times, and to documents and admissions made there, which were collected for us by Mike Lepic, who drove to that conference. And I will do without my slides so as to go more quickly. Specifically, the Soviet officials said it was the Soviet attempt to reject the SDI and to overcome it with nuclear and conventional military arms buildup, which led to that collapse. Lyndon LaRouche had warned them very publicly in 1982 and many times afterwards that this would happen by 1988 if they took the road of rejecting his SDI. It was the actions of Lyndon LaRouche himself and through his collaborators in that period, changing the strategic policy of the United States and for some time threatening to change the economic and strategic policy of the world's major nations, which led directly to his legal persecution, to the attempt to kill him during the massive police raids on Leesburg in October 1986, and to his continuing imprisonment. Following Reagan's adoption of his SDI, Soviet attention was riveted on LaRouche, its author, and the destruction of his influence was demanded from the highest levels of the regime of Yuri Andropov and later that of Mikhail Gorbachev. Here is the crucial sequence of events by which LaRouche's successful intervention into the events of national and global policy in 1982 and 83 brought the Soviet reaction which led to his imprisonment. You will learn the background of these events in much more detail in this evening's presentations. Here is the simple timeline. First, July 1977, Lyndon LaRouche commissioned the first ever mass circulation report to the American people on the subject of anti-missile defense and the new physical principles involved in it. This report was called Sputnik of the 70s, the idea expressed being that this was not, as Sputnik was not, a weapon, a military device, but rather represented a new physical and technological principle which would revolutionize scientific and military questions. And this was, and such a thing was, such a change was to be the relativistic anti-missile beam weapons. In August 1979 already, LaRouche and his representatives held the first discussions with campaign personnel from Ronald Reagan's presidential campaign on energy beam defense. In February 1980, during a New Hampshire presidential debate sponsored by the National Rifle Association, LaRouche first raised the subject with Reagan personally. Many of you have seen the photo of them talking on the podium of that debate. In January, February 1981, the transition period of the Reagan administration, LaRouche and his representatives had meetings on the strategic doctrine and related scientific and energy policies with Energy Secretary Donald Hodel, Interior Secretary James Watt, Science Advisor Dr. George Keyworth, State Department official Richard Morris. Shortly later that year, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche met with CIA Deputy Director Robert Inman on the same subject. In July of 1981, a full 2 years before the SDI policy was announced, LaRouche's Political Action Committee, the NDPC, released for a mass circulation pamphlet called A Democratic U.S. Defense Policy. That pamphlet was devoted entirely to a full explication of a strategic defense initiative policy. This was in July of 1981, and most of the contents were written by LaRouche personally. In April of 1981, Soviet representatives at the United Nations approached representatives of LaRouche several times seeking discussion of his assessment of the incoming Reagan administration and of strategic questions. In the fall of 1981, LaRouche and his representatives met regularly with officials of the CIA and other intelligence representatives to discuss LaRouche's beam weapons military strategy. The Reagan National Security Council official, Richard Morris, testified in two trials, once in the Alexandria trial of LaRouche, and then later in May 1990 during the prosecution of associates of LaRouche in Roanoke, Virginia, testified in both cases that the anti-missile defense systems were one of 6 areas being dealt with in these discussions between LaRouche and intelligence and security officials of the Reagan administration. In December of 1981, the administration requested through intelligence agencies that LaRouche attempt back-channel discussions with Soviet representatives about the new scientific and military strategy which LaRouche represented, and about how the Soviets would react if this strategy were adopted by the United States. In February 1982, EIR sponsored a Washington, D.C. conference on LaRouche's anti-missile defense policy. It was attended by more than 300 representatives of the U.S. government, Soviet and East Bloc representatives, and others. LaRouche gave the keynote on relativistic beam weapons. In February 1982, the same week, in private meetings around that major public conference, LaRouche succeeded in opening the desired back channel for U.S. policy involving himself and Soviet Washington embassy official Yevgeny Shershnev with constant consultation and reporting to the U.S. government. The subject of the back channel discussions was the possible adoption by the Reagan administration of LaRouche's proposed new beam weapons military doctrine. In October and November of 1982, while this continued, Henry Kissinger and others on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board made their first written requests to the FBI, to Director Webster, asking for the targeting and investigation of Lyndon LaRouche. Interestingly, at the same time, late 1982, the same Intelligence Advisory Board and other U.S. Intelligence agencies published a secret intelligence assessment. This assessment was made public only last month at this same Princeton conference. It had been top secret for 10 years. On reading that assessment, which was used by President Reagan in the first 25 minutes of his speech, where he described the Soviet strategy and strategic buildup, that assessment acknowledged that Soviet training and weapons procurement was shifting towards a nuclear first strike and towards a first strike against Europe in particular. However, that assessment never at any point acknowledged that the United States might be considering, that the Reagan administration might be considering a change in strategic doctrine. The people who prepared it simply didn't know. January 1, 1983, at a conference like this one, LaRouche told a conference in New York City that the Reagan administration must, within 90 days, he said, January 1st, 83, must within 90 days scrap the MAD doctrine and adopt an anti-missile defense doctrine, or the world was on a course towards war. December 22nd of 1982, just before that, EIR published LaRouche's reply to Soviet critics. This was a detailed warning to the Soviet leadership based on what he had been told by Shershnev in these back-channel negotiations. LaRouche warned the Soviet leadership that if they refused cooperative development of a new energy and particle beam anti-missile defense, the underlying problems of the Soviet economy would lead to its collapse. In February of 1983, the month before Reagan's announcement, the official Shershnev in the talks detailed to LaRouche why the Soviet leadership would reject his doctrine. He said that LaRouche's doctrine would work militarily, it would work scientifically, but its development would be to the advantage of the West's superior scientific and productivity capabilities. Therefore, the Soviets would reject it. In the same month, LaRouche returned from Europe where he had held seminars for European military and officials and officers. He received this Soviet rebuttal and had intensive shuttling negotiations between officials of the Reagan administration and the Soviet embassy officials. In that same month, February 1983, the same Soviet representative told LaRouche that the Soviet leadership had been assured by the and was confident that the leadership of the Democratic Party in the United States and moderate Republicans in the administration would block any move by President Reagan to adopt this new doctrine. In late February 1983, LaRouche's PAC, the National Democratic Policy Committee, again published a mass circulation pamphlet. This was one of many, How to Eliminate the Threat of Nuclear Holocaust. This was a full explication of how beam weapons work by a Fusion Energy Foundation scientist. The rest of it was written by LaRouche on the doctrine. The front page of the pamphlet said, "Let us make the month of March the month in which the message of anti-missile beam defense reaches every household in the United States and policy changes." So you see, if we try, we can do these things. On March 14th, 1983, LaRouche scientific representative Uwe Parpart met with National Security Council scientists and consultants on the possibility of a forthcoming Reagan announcement of a new strategic doctrine. On March 16th, LaRouche representatives Jeff Steinberg and myself met in the Pentagon with 9 officers, generals, and other officers of the Air Force, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the Navy. We were told by all of them who truly believed this that there was no immediate prospect of any change in American strategic policy. This policy did not come from the Pentagon. On March 23rd, 1983, Ronald Reagan finished a nationally televised address on the Soviet military buildup by announcing the new doctrine known as the SDI. The form of anti-missile defense doctrine that he announced was uniquely LaRouche's, calling for fundamentally new beam technologies rather than the old interceptor missiles. Also, he offered to share these technologies with the Soviets in a cooperative effort to end MAD and make the new defensive technologies available to all countries. This was distinctly LaRouche's policy. Andropov Soviet leadership was shocked and attributed vastly greater influence to LaRouche. Said Foreign Minister Besmertnik at this same Princeton conference recently, "The SDI put us in a very dangerous situation." Secretary of State Schultz, speaking at that same conference last month, noted that the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff were floored, in his words, by Reagan's announcement. The next day, March 24th, 83, I was interviewed by CBS Television Evening News as the first non-governmental spokesman to support and explain the new and furious defense doctrine which had been announced. The significance is not the interview, but how it came about. CBS Television contacted the Heritage Foundation, which was the, some of you remember, was the think tank of the Reagan administration, a British-dominated institution denounced by us, from which most Reagan administration policies percolated. The staff director of the Heritage Foundation told CBS Television that they knew nothing about this, and when pressed further by CBS, they said, "This is the Fusion Energy Foundation's thing," and gave CBS the names of Uwe Parpart, myself, perhaps others. This led to this interview on the Evening News that night. The following morning, Parpart was interviewed on Good Morning America, and this is how Americans first learned what this was all about. On May 24th to 28th, 1983, a high-powered KGB delegation of 25 came to the United States, headed by Fyodor Berlotsky, a journalist, an intimate of Gorbachev, who was not yet General Secretary. This delegation was sponsored by the Soviet USA-Canada Institute, the America experts of the Soviet Union, by Georgy Arbatov, the head of that institute. Just before this conference occurred, Shershnev, the Soviet representative in the back-channel negotiations, had told LaRouche that they were over, that they were being terminated, and that he was going back to Moscow. The purpose of the conference from which the Soviet delegation came, which was called the U.S.-USSR Bilateral Exchange Conference, was to meet with associates of Walter Mondale, about to be the Democratic Party's presidential candidate, and declare war on the SDI. On August 10th of that year, Berlatsky in the weekly Literaturная Gazeta attacked the SDI and by implication LaRouche as a cause for war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In August 1983, the same month, Democratic National Chairman Charles Manat publicly declared war on Reagan's SDI policy and said all Democratic candidates for president in '84 would oppose it completely, despite its broad popular support. In September 1983, the next month, LaRouche proved him wrong by announcing his own candidacy for the Democratic nomination and immediately preparing both television broadcasts and mass circulation campaign pamphlets on the military doctrine of the LaRouche administration, as he called it, which was the SDI. October 26, '83, Berlatsky, in the same publication, reiterated his casus belli statement on the SDI and attacked, quote, the American LaRouche for it. November 18th of 1983, the Izvestia published an attack on LaRouche. March 1984, NBC Television's primetime half-hour program First Camera attacked, quote, the LaRouche factor in the Reagan administration. Shortly after that, the New Republic magazine made the same attack. They called their cover story the LaRouche Connection, and on the cover it said, since 1981, a handful of fanatics associated with Lyndon LaRouche, I had the slide, but I'm paraphrasing a little now, have been meeting with officials, intelligence and other officials of the Reagan administration. Their purpose, to gain influence and to change Reagan's strategic policy. They succeeded. That was the cover of the New Republic. Immediately after that, all these contacts were, quote-unquote, exposed in a 10,000-word series of articles in the Washington Post in an attempt to get them to stop. March 8, 1984, Democratic Party Chairman Charles Manat held a Chicago press conference and demanded that Reagan immediately break all administration ties with LaRouche and his associates. 4 days later, March 12th, Izvestia demanded that Reagan break all administration contact with LaRouche and his associates, which Izvestia called a scandal which the White House does not even try to deny. On April 2nd, the Pravda published an attack on LaRouche. September of 1984, LaRouche, in a national television broadcast, denounced Walter Mondale as an agent of KGB influence for his campaign against the SDI. That October, the Department of Justice began its first attempt to prosecute LaRouche and his associates just before the presidential elections. In April to June of 1985, the Fusion Energy Foundation held major conferences in Rome, Paris, and Bonn on the Strategic Defense Initiative to inform European military leaders, many of whom had still not been briefed, and scientists of the work involved in the SDI and the implications for economic progress worldwide. In July of 1985, EIR published Global Showdown on the Soviet military buildup. LaRouche's 1983 warning to the Soviet leadership was repeated there in much greater detail. To wit, the East Bloc economies would break down under this military buildup by 1988 unless the Soviets accepted the new scientific and technological driver offered by the SDI, or unless they went to war by 1988. In February 1986, the Department of Justice launched another campaign to suppress LaRouche's movement, holding a nationwide meeting in Boston to which the DOJ summoned prosecutors from around the country, local prosecutors, and asked them to start prosecutions of LaRouche. In February, March of 1986, after a relative interlude under Chernenko, whose actual condition of life was never quite certain when he was General Secretary, when Gorbachev took over, attacks resumed on LaRouche. The KGB immediately conducted an international dirty trick, attempting to blame LaRouche for the assassination of Olof Palme. This will be discussed in more detail. In April of 1986, the FEF held a major conference in Tokyo, attended by nearly 300 Japanese scientific, business, and military representatives, and addressed by scientists from Europe, the US, and Japan. The subject was the urgency of Japan cooperating with the SDI. Soviet embassy representatives protested and then walked out during the speech of LaRouche's representative Uwe Parpert. 2 months later, Japan's Foreign Minister Abe announced Japan's scientific labs would join the SDI. In May of 1986, Ronald Reagan repeated in writing to Gorbachev the original SDI offer to share the new technologies essential to anti-missile defenses. He reiterated this in a speech at the United Nations. From July through October 1986, the Soviet press repeatedly called for investigation and prosecution of LaRouche. You will see all of these Soviet attacks and their authors in more detail later in the panel. In the fall of 1986, Gorbachev and the Soviet military leadership planned to use the Reykjavik, Iceland summit, which was coming up in the first week of October of that year, to force Reagan to abandon the SDI. At this same Princeton conference last month, there were agonized admissions about the debates between the military and Communist Party leaders in the Soviet Union about how to use the Reykjavik summit, what to offer, what to threaten, how to use it in order to force Reagan to abandon the SDI. At the same time, the international media insisted that the SDI was not an issue of the Reykjavik summit coming up. In September 24th, 86, Georgy Arbatov in Reykjavik gave a pre-summit press briefing. This is quoting the Danish press. Arbatov maintained his friendly facade only until Mr. Rasmussen of EIR asked a question. Arbatov then denounced EIR as LaRouche fascist and closed down his friendly press conference. September 30th, a week later, Sovietskaya Kultura magazine denounced LaRouche's policy input to the Reagan administration, accused him of tax fraud, and demanded, why isn't the Internal Revenue Service interested in prosecuting LaRouche? October 3rd of 86, 3 days before the summit, Gorbachev stopped in East Berlin and gave a speech denouncing the hidden Nazis without swastikas, which at that time was the format for references and attacks on LaRouche in the Soviet media. On October 6th, 2 days, or actually 1 day before the beginning of the summit, 450 armed agents of the FBI, IRS, Virginia State Police, and other agencies conducted a massive raid on LaRouche Publications headquarters in Leesburg. LaRouche's residence was completely surrounded by armed agents, armored cars, personnel carriers, and helicopters. A shootout and killing of LaRouche was threatened throughout the day. Leaders of LaRouche's movement were indicted, and U.S. Attorney Weld in Boston was attempting to get indictments of LaRouche himself. Immediately following that, Weld was nominated to become the number 3 man in the Justice Department. On October 7th, the next day, the first day of the summit, in Reykjavik, Arbatov again, in front of hundreds and hundreds of international journalists, shouted fascist, LaRouche fascists at EIR correspondents who tried to ask him a question. They asked it instead to Soviet official Yevgeny Velikov, who told reporters that the Soviets could not accept the American SDI. Again, the SDI was supposedly not an issue at this summit. Soviet press spokesman Alexander Bovin at that summit called the EIR a dirty, dirty magazine. That same day, October 7th, the same day, while 1,000 journalists waited outside the summit meetings in Reykjavik, cable news network entertained them by replaying film of the massive anti-LaRouche raids in Virginia the previous day. October 8, 1986, when Secretary of State Shultz finally emerged from an 8-hour summit session, he said that broad arms control agreements could have been had, but, said Shultz, the agreements are being blocked by Soviet insistence that the United States give up the SDI. All 1,000 journalists were thrown into total confusion because until that moment, all of the international press except EIR had insisted that the SDI was not an issue at all at this summit. On April 20th, 1987, the United States Department of Justice, in an action with no precedent in U.S. history, acted alone to bankrupt, seize, and liquidate the major publications associated with LaRouche, seizing their subscription lists as well. At the time of the seizure, Fusion magazine, the consistent vehicle to circulate worldwide the scientific basis of LaRouche's beam weapons policy, had in the United States 140,000 subscribers, including 28,000 subscriptions in colleges and high schools, 7,000 subscriptions in the country's national laboratories. In September of 1987, LaRouche was personally indicted for conspiracy for the first time by the federal government. This was now increasingly a government of then Vice President Bush, which was pushing the SDI aside. On October 12, 1988, LaRouche, in a televised Berlin press conference, forecast for the third time the breakup of Soviet control of Eastern Europe and the reunification of Germany. For the third time, he detailed that the Soviet bloc could not go any further than 1988 in its military buildup. He proposed specific initiatives by the West to start rebuilding. October 14th, 2 days later, LaRouche was indicted on the same conspiracy charges for the second time by the federal government, again just before a presidential election in which he was a candidate. January 27, 1989, LaRouche was imprisoned with a 15-year sentence on the eve of the breakup of the Soviet Union that he had been forecasting. November 1989, Soviet General Staff documents written in that month, again made public only this last year. In November 89, those documents showed that active attempts by the Soviet military to train for a Red Army first strike and nuclear blitzkrieg against Europe were still continuing. This brings us to the second chance for durable peace and economic construction created by the Soviet Empire's breakup. Admittedly, as they admit, because of rejecting and trying to defeat the Reagan-LaRouche offer of 1983. This is part of what this panel will now present in detail, the more fundamental issues of LaRouche's method behind these events, the method of changing history. But these events themselves show beyond any doubt what LaRouche has described as the sole cause for his imprisonment and the absolute necessity of his being freed before this second chance is utterly lost.
By delivering the following brief message at the close of his nationwide television address.
In recent months, however, my advisors, including in particular the Joint Chiefs of Staff, have underscored the necessity to break out of a future that relies solely on offensive retaliation for our security. Over the course of these discussions, I've become more and more deeply convinced that the human spirit must be capable of rising above dealing with other nations and human beings by threatening their existence. It's a sad commentary on the, wouldn't it be better to save lives than to avenge them? Are we not capable of demonstrating our peaceful intentions by applying all our abilities and our ingenuity to achieving a truly lasting stability? I think we are. Indeed, we must. After careful consultation with my advisors, including the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I believe there is a way. Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive. Let us turn to the very strengths in technology that spawned our great industrial base and that have given us the quality of life we enjoy today. What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies? It will take years, probably decades of effort on many fronts. There will be failures and setbacks, just as there will be successes and breakthroughs. And as we proceed, we must remain constant in preserving the nuclear deterrent and maintaining a solid capability for flexible response. But isn't it worth every investment necessary to free the world from the threat of nuclear war? We know it is. I clearly recognize that defensive systems have limitations and raise certain problems and ambiguities. If paired with offensive systems, they can be viewed as fostering an aggressive policy, and no one wants that. But with these considerations firmly in mind, I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. Tonight, consistent with our obligations under the ABM Treaty and recognizing the need for closer consultation with our allies, I'm taking an important first step. I am directing a comprehensive and intensive effort to define a long-term research and development program to begin to achieve our ultimate goal of eliminating the threat posed by strategic nuclear missiles. This could pave the way for arms control measures to eliminate the weapons themselves. We seek neither military superiority nor political advantage. Our only purpose, one all people share, is to search for ways to reduce the danger of nuclear war. My fellow Americans, tonight we're launching an effort which holds the promise of changing the course of human history. There will be risks, and the results take time, but I believe we can do it. As we cross this threshold, I ask for your prayers and your support. Thank you, good night, and God bless you.
Exactly 3 minutes and 30 seconds, and the world was irreversibly changed as the result of that speech. The following day, March 24th, 1983, in a public statement issued from Wiesbaden, West Germany, Lyndon LaRouche offered his personal congratulations and support to the President with the following words: "No longer must Democrats go to bed each night fearing that they must live out their lives under the threat of thermonuclear ballistic terror. The coming several years will be probably the most difficult of the entire post-war period. But for the first time since the end of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, there is at last hope that the thermonuclear nightmare will be ended during the remainder of this decade. Only high-level officials of government or a private citizen as intimately knowledgeable of details of the international political and strategic situation as I am privileged to be can even begin to foresee the earth-shaking impact of the President's television address last night will have throughout the world. No one can foresee what the exact consequences of the President's actions will be. We cannot foresee how ferocious and stubborn resistance to the President's policy will be, both from Moscow and from the nuclear freeze advocates in Europe and the United States itself. Whatever those reactions and their influence, the words the President spoke last night can never be put back in the bottle. Most of the world will soon know and will never forget that policy announcement. With those words, the President has changed the course of modern history. Today, I am prouder to be an American than I have been since the first manned landing on the moon. For the first time in 20 years, a President of the United States has contributed a public action of great leadership to give a new basis for hope to humanity's future, to an agonized and demoralized world. True greatness in an American president touched President Ronald Reagan last night. It is a moment of greatness never to be forgotten. Lyndon LaRouche's prophetic comments on President Reagan's March 23rd address were based on his own intimate involvement in the process leading up to the President's adoption of what he labeled the Strategic Defense Initiative. From Moscow to London to Washington, among the small circle of the world's most powerful political figures, friends and enemies alike, there was absolutely no doubt that President Reagan had adopted Lyndon LaRouche's strategic doctrine. Against all odds, the power of an idea devised and promulgated by Lyndon LaRouche had touched the President of the United States and a small handful of his most loyal advisors, and history was made. For some leading figures in Moscow, one of the critical questions left unanswered by the TV address on March 23rd was whether President Reagan's adoption of the ballistic missile defense mutually assured survival doctrine also meant that he had consciously adopted LaRouche's Operation Juarez proposal for the establishment of a just new world economic order. But on the question of ballistic missile defense, there was absolutely no doubt in Moscow. Earlier in the afternoon of March 23rd, at a National Security Council background briefing for the White House press corps, details of the President's 8 p.m. TV address had been filled out. At that briefing, it was made clear that President Reagan would propose that the United States and the Soviet Union work together to make the doctrine of mutually assured survival a reality. Shortly after the President's speech, Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger more formally conveyed the offer to Moscow for the two superpowers to work together to develop and deploy a strategic ballistic missile defense system. Not only was Lyndon LaRouche the intellectual author of the policy concept behind SDI, between December 1981 and the date of the President's speech, Lyndon LaRouche, acting on behalf of and at the behest of the Reagan White House and other U.S. government agencies, personally conducted back-channel negotiations with high-level representatives of the Soviet government. As the result of those negotiations, Moscow was fully informed well over a year in advance of the President's March 23rd speech of the details of the policy offer. And because of LaRouche's personal role in those discussions, Moscow had no justifiable reason to doubt the sincerity of President Reagan's offer. Had Moscow decided to take up President Reagan's most generous proposal, rather than adopting the suicidal alternative, the now proven suicidal alternative, Lyndon LaRouche would have unquestionably been called upon to continue in his role as broker and guarantor of a new era of world peace and prosperity based on a thorough transformation of East-West and North-South relations. Tragically, LaRouche was right when he warned on March 24th about the reactions that would come spilling out of the crevices in Moscow, London, New York, and Washington. But he was also right when he said that the actions taken by President Reagan could never be put back in the bottle. President Reagan's March 23rd address came as a result of years of effort. Lyndon LaRouche and his associates had been talking about ballistic missile defense, employing new physical principles since 1977. We've seen some of the documentation of that already. During the perilous years of the Carter presidency, Mr. LaRouche had served as an unofficial channel of communications between elements inside the official U.S. intelligence establishment and some of their Soviet intelligence counterparts. This was part of a fail-safe system built up by sane individuals on both sides of the East-West divide to minimize the danger of a misunderstanding triggering a strategic confrontation, possibly even a thermonuclear war. LaRouche was solicited for this effort in part in response to his Election Eve 1976 nationwide TV address in which he warned of the dangers of thermonuclear war should Jimmy Carter and the Trilateral Commission come into office. In early March of 1981, a senior Soviet diplomat posted at the Permanent Mission to the United Nations, Mr. Kudashev, approached DIR's Asian Affairs editor Dan Snyder, soliciting LaRouche's views on the new Reagan administration. On recommendation from the same U.S. intelligence channels through which the earlier Soviet discussions had been conducted, word of that approach and a detailed summary of the discussion was forwarded to then White House counselor Edwin Meese. By the early autumn of that year, 1981, Lyndon LaRouche had spelled out his proposals for a joint or parallel U.S.-Soviet strategic ballistic missile defense program. During this same period, representatives of EIR held preliminary discussions with a senior diplomat at the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., named Mr. Shershenev. Those topics covered economic issues and even began touching upon this issue of strategic ballistic missile defense. As the result of these developments, in December 1981, Lyndon LaRouche was again approached by senior U.S. intelligence officials and formally asked to initiate back-channel discussions with appropriate Soviet representatives on the possible adoption of a modification of existing strategic doctrine, i.e. LaRouche's own mutually assured survival concept. LaRouche was informed that the back-channel discussions were classified as a compartmentalized secret operation known to a relatively select number of senior officials under all of the appropriate code names that would go along with such an operation. By this time, Lyndon and Helga LaRouche had met personally with CIA Deputy Director Bobby Ray Inman at the agency's facility adjacent to the old executive office building in the White House in downtown Washington. In support of his back-channel efforts on behalf of the ballistic missile defense policy, on February 18th through 19th, 1982, LaRouche participated in a two-day EIR seminar on the subject and related topics in Washington, D.C. Of the more than 300 attendees at the conference, quite a number of them were Soviet and Warsaw Pact diplomats. At an EIR reception for participants in that conference later in the same week, LaRouche was introduced personally to Mr. Shershnev, and they had the first of quite a number of discussions about strategic policy issues affecting the United States and the Soviet Union. At their first private discussion, which took place in a suite at the Hay Adams Hotel in Washington shortly after the February 1982 event, LaRouche informed Shershnev that he had been designated by the Reagan administration to conduct exploratory discussions, and that he would distinguish clearly when he was conveying official messages from U.S. government agencies and when he was providing his own personal evaluations. Recently, Mr. LaRouche remembered a few details of that discussion. Mr. Shershnev, who many of us had the chance to meet during various of those talks in the 1982 to 83 period, was the classic Soviet diplomat. Calm, generally deadpan, monotone, very serious, fairly intelligent. When Mr. LaRouche described this official back-channel role that he would be playing, as LaRouche remembered it, Shershnev's eyes bugged out of his head, and when they returned back to their sockets, the conversation continued in the typical Soviet monotones. But clearly, the implications of LaRouche taking up this kind of back-channel function at the official behest of officials of the U.S. government had significant implications, and those implications registered very clearly. In the early spring of 1982, Admiral Inman announced his resignation as Deputy Director of the CIA, effective several months later. The channels under whose auspices LaRouche had been carrying out the negotiations with Moscow's representatives informed him at that point that the operation was, at least for the time being, aborted. Sensitive to the importance of maintaining the ongoing channel, and equally sensitive to the highly restricted need-to-know security surrounding the back-channel negotiations, LaRouche prepared a written memo to Edwin Meese seeking some guidance on how to proceed. That memo was hand-delivered by a representative of the National Security Council, with the appointment of Judge William Clark as Special Advisor to the President for National Security Affairs in January of 1982. LaRouche representatives had established ongoing discussions with a number of NSC officers. In one of his testimonies in one of the Virginia trials, Richard Morris reported the fact that when he and Judge Clark arrived at the National Security Council in January 1982, there were already stacks of memos from Lyndon LaRouche and notes of correspondence and meetings that had taken place between LaRouche and representatives of the NSC. So he acknowledged that when they walked into that position, the back-channel discussions involving LaRouche and the White House security staff were already ongoing. After Ed Meese failed to provide any clear response to the LaRouche memo, Richard Morris, the executive assistant to NSC advisor Clark, informed LaRouche that the council would take charge of the operation and that the sanctioned back-channel negotiations should continue uninterrupted. Henceforth, the results of those discussions would be reported directly to the National Security Advisor's executive director for passage up the policy line to the President. By the autumn of 1982, momentum had built up inside sections of the U.S. military and intelligence establishment in support of Lyndon LaRouche's ballistic missile defense proposals. General Volney Warner, a retired head of the U.S. Army's Force Command, told LaRouche associates, myself included, in October 1982, in a private discussion at his office, that the policy was winning strong support among some of the President's key advisors. General Warner implored us to turn up the heat, to escalate the political campaign, not just in the United States, but around the world, because it was clearly recognized that we were the driving force in impelling this policy towards the direction of actual formal implementation. Also in October, Edward Teller, a close personal friend and informal science advisor to President Reagan, threw his support behind ballistic missile defense, citing recent breakthroughs at the Lawrence Livermore laboratories on some of the very new physical principle approaches advocated by LaRouche. Significantly, Teller also advocated the idea of sharing these scientific and technological breakthroughs with Moscow. LaRouche publicly alluded to his role in the back-channel process in a December 12, 1982 EIR memorandum entitled "The Cultural Determinants of an Anti-Missile Beam Weapons Policy." Quote, "During the months since I first announced the proposed beam weapons policy, since February of this past year, I have had a number of occasions to discuss this policy with Soviet and other East Bloc representatives, both in person and through relayed communications. In such discussions, one must acknowledge that the Soviet representative in question is speaking as a representative of his government to me as a person whom that representative views as connected to policy influencing agencies of the United States. Therefore, the kinds of discussions which occur have two functional aspects. In one aspect, each of us is speaking for the record. I am careful to indicate what I believe to be my government's policy, as well as I know that policy for the record. My Soviet discussion partner in each case will do the same. Then, apart from such statements of policy for the record, we are able to enter into a more or less frank discussion of possible other additional policy options," unquote. LaRouche again addressed all of these issues in his December 31st, 1982 speech at the International Caucus of Labor Committees Conference in New York City. Referencing his beam defense program, LaRouche observed, and again I quote, "If we succeed, if President Reagan does this thing in the coming weeks, then we shall have administered to that ancient foe of our people and of the human race, the Harrimans et al., the Malthusians, not a killer blow, but a very deadly defeat, a sharp reduction of the Malthusian power internationally. We shall have cleared the decks, weakened the enemies of humanity, to the point that those who are not the enemies of humanity are given a greater latitude for making decisions without having to submit to the Harrimans and that crowd in the period ahead." It is in that sense, in that act, which I believe in this great tragedy through which we are now living, that choice is the punctum salient of our age. Either we can grab it, or I know not what we can do. In the early weeks of February 1983, back in Washington, Lyndon LaRouche again conferred with Mr. Shershnev, this time in a suite at the Sheraton Carlton Hotel. In that discussion, Shershnev delivered a three-part message to LaRouche and through LaRouche to the Reagan White House, straight from Moscow. Point number one, the Soviet government would reject SDI. Point number two, Soviet studies of LaRouche's BMD proposal had proven that they were sound and viable. However, under conditions of crash development, the Soviet economy would be incapable of keeping pace with a revived U.S. economy. Therefore, it was principally on economic grounds that Moscow would reject the package. Point three, through other channels of discussion with the highest levels of the Democratic Party and even certain circles in and around the Reagan administration, Moscow had been informed that LaRouche's ballistic missile defense proposal would never reach the president's desk, and that therefore there was no danger of Reagan administration ever actually adopting the plan. Under those circumstances, since Moscow found the back-channel talks with LaRouche useful, they would be continued. Not surprisingly, March 23, 1983, hit Moscow like a ton of bricks. Closer to home, the combat had already begun in earnest. In his autobiography, President Reagan gave a hint of the battle. Some of these are excerpts from his personal diaries, which were written contemporaneously with these developments. March 22nd, 1983. Another day that shouldn't happen. On my desk was a draft of the speech on defense to be delivered tomorrow night on TV. This was one hassled over by NSC, State, and Defense. Finally, I had a crack at it. March 23rd, 1983. The big thing today was the 8 p.m. TV speech on all networks about national security. We've been working on the speech for about 72 hours and right down to the deadline. I did the bulk of the speech on why our arms buildup was necessary and then finished with a call to the science community to join me in research starting now to develop defensive weapons that would render nuclear missiles obsolete. I made no optimistic forecasts, said it might take 20 years or more, but we had to do it. I felt good. Years after that historic date, I received the first-hand account from one of the key figures at the National Security Council who was directly involved in these SDI back channels, informing me of what actually happened on March 23rd. James Baker III, as the White House Chief of Staff, was officially the last person assigned to review the President's speeches before the final version was passed on to Reagan for approval. The SDI portion of the speech had been written under the auspices of Judge Clark at the National Security Council and had been formally prepared by a White House speechwriter named Aram Bakshian, who had been in contact with EIR for some time, initially courtesy of Richard Morris. Many of the discussions that took place with Bakshian centered around precisely the concepts of the ballistic missile defense, mutually assured survival, the economic spin effects of the program, and all of the things that we've discussed here tonight. When James Baker III saw the ballistic missile defense section of the speech, he personally went ballistic. He removed the entire final section, eliminating any mention of SDI. Fortunately, Judge Clark was alerted to Baker's perfidy, and in a complete violation of White House protocol, and everybody knows how much White House protocol means around this town, bypassed James Baker, personally slipped into President Reagan's office, and alerted the President to the deleted portions of the speech. To his credit, Reagan personally reinserted the SDI announcement. James Baker didn't find out about it until about 8:20 that night, when the President read those fateful words to the American people. Ironically, from Wiesbaden, West Germany, Lyndon LaRouche had such a pulse-beat sense of the fight surrounding his strategic defense policy that even after being informed of the late afternoon White House background briefing in which the SDI announcement was prominently featured, he warned us back in New York to watch the 8 o'clock telecast to be sure that nothing had been done at the last moment to sabotage the President's public announcement. The tape that we played earlier tonight is a memorial to the fact that we were all glued to the TV and radio that night to make sure that those fateful words were indeed included in the public version of the address. I can assure you that there are leading figures from the Reagan administration who stood with us in the SDI fight who will probably never forgive James Baker for what he tried to do that day. If you want to understand why this rumor surfaced the day after the presidential elections last year that Ronald Reagan had not voted for George Bush, consider the significance of this SDI sequence of events on March 23rd. In one of those fortuitous quirks of scheduling, EIR and the Fusion Energy Foundation had arranged a conference on the Strategic Defense Plan for mid-April in Washington, D.C. at the Vista Hotel. The event had been scheduled prior to the President's March 23rd speech. It was a standing room-only crowd of approximately 800 people. Mr. Shershnev sat in the front row. Afterwards, in a meeting with EIR's Washington bureau chief, Shershnev conceded that his and Moscow's hardline attitudes towards LaRouche's strategic defense proposals had been a mistake. He added that with the President's March 23rd announcement, the situation was too big at this point for him to personally continue to handle. He reported that he had recommended a face-to-face meeting between LaRouche and Georgy Arbatov, the head of the U.S.-Canada Institute. This recommendation was at that very moment being reviewed at the highest levels back in Moscow. 2 weeks later, approximately, the back channel was abruptly shut down on orders from Moscow. Shershnev was shortly thereafter summoned back home. In a few moments, Rachel Douglas will pick up this chronology from the eye's view in Moscow. I just wish to end with one final postscript. Even after the Soviet government's rejection of the SDI policy, Lyndon LaRouche never abandoned the idea that this was the last best hope for mankind. On September 2nd, 1983, the day after the KAL 007 downing, which LaRouche had warned about in advance, LaRouche wrote to Georgy Arbatov, "There is no possible route to war avoidance," LaRouche said, "except the general strategic doctrine that I have proposed. Since we must either end up agreeing to what the President has offered on March 23rd, 1983, or destroy one another, the only worthwhile discussion is a discussion of means to reach such war avoidance agreement. I am not in the least insensitive to the deep implications of the leading points I propose to discuss. I know there are aspects of this matter which are most painful by their very nature to the Russian world outlook. The issue of the 1439 Council of Florence, the issue of Plato versus Aristotle. Yet, experience shows that unless Soviet thinkers in responsible positions can fight through precisely these issues with me, avoidance of war may be impossible, since the philosophical basis for conducting such negotiations may be impossible. How much psychological discomfort of this sort would your associates be willing to endure for so unimportant a matter as perhaps saving the Soviet Union from thermonuclear holocaust? These blunt but hopeful words, so typical of the vision that Lyndon LaRouche brought into all of his dealings with Moscow, and for that matter, his dealings with representatives of every government around the world, great and small, spoke of axiomatics that are as valid today as they were a decade ago. Now more than ever, the world needs Lyndon LaRouche, in the flesh and blood, free to shake things up and pull together the kind of international combination of people of goodwill that passed the world, albeit imperfectly, through the punctum salient of 1983. Thank you.